The afternoon of St. Mary Mead's annual autumn fete had settled into that golden hour when shadows grow long and conversations turn gentle. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the old elm tree beside the church wall, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm while her pale blue eyes observed the pleasant bustle around her. The village green hummed with the comfortable sounds of a community at ease, children's laughter, the clink of teacups, and the satisfied murmur of neighbors catching up on local news. "Such a lovely turnout this year," she remarked to Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had paused in her organizational duties to catch her breath. "Though I do notice Mrs. Ashford from Ivy Cottage hasn't made an appearance. She's usually so devoted to these gatherings." Mrs. Bantry followed Miss Marple's gaze toward the cottage that stood somewhat apart from the village center, its ivy-covered walls and neat garden visible through the gap between the post office and the baker's shop. Poor Millicent has been rather reclusive lately. Ever since that business with her London relatives last month, she's seemed quite unsettled. Dr. Haydock mentioned she'd been having trouble sleeping. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. Ah, yes, the unexpected visitors. Mrs. Clement mentioned seeing a rather heated discussion in the cottage garden. Family matters can be so trying, can't they? The fete continued its gentle rhythm around them. Colonel Bantry struggled manfully with the coconut shy while his wife directed the arrangement of prize vegetables with military precision. Young Timothy Fletcher had finally conquered the rebellious Bunting, and Mrs. Price's Victoria sponge had claimed its usual place of honor among the baked goods. Yet Miss Marple found her attention drawn repeatedly to Ivy Cottage, where the windows remained dark despite the afternoon's warmth. Mrs. Millicent Ashford had moved to St. Mary Mead 3 years prior, a widow of comfortable means, seeking the peace of village life after decades in London. She had integrated well into the community, contributing generously to church funds and village improvements, though she maintained a certain reserve that suggested secrets carefully guarded. Her cottage, with its well-tended garden and pristine interior, had become a focal point for the village's more refined social gatherings. "I believe I saw someone leaving the cottage rather hurriedly this morning," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying that tone of innocent curiosity that so often encouraged confidences. "A gentleman in a dark coat, walking quite quickly toward the station. Mrs. Daly mentioned he'd been calling regularly these past few weeks." Mrs. Bantry's expression grew troubled. "That would be her nephew, Gerald Ashford. He's been pressing her about some family business, though Millicent's been quite tight-lipped about the details. She did mention something about papers that needed signing, but she seemed rather distressed. About it all?" The conversation was interrupted by young Bert Higgins, the baker's boy, who came running across the green with his face flushed and his breath coming in short gasps. He made straight for Dr. Haydock, who was judging the flower arrangements with the focused attention of a man trying to avoid Mrs. Price's pointed hints about her roses. Dr. Haydock." Bert's voice carried across the green with such urgency that conversations faltered and heads turned. "You must come quickly. It's Mrs. Ashford at Ivy Cottage. Something terrible has happened." The festive atmosphere dissolved like sugar in rain. Dr. Haydock immediately gathered his medical bag, while the vicar moved to organize the concerned crowd that began forming around young Bert. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with careful precision, her expression remaining calm while her mind began cataloguing the various reactions she observed. "I went to deliver her usual order," Bert explained, his words tumbling over each other. "The front door was standing open, which seemed odd because she's always so particular about keeping it locked. I called out, but there was no answer. The sitting room was all disturbed, furniture knocked about, and Mrs. Ashford—" He swallowed hard. "She's lying on the floor near the fireplace. There's blood, Doctor. Quite a lot of blood." Dr. Haydock strode purposefully toward Ivy Cottage, followed by a small procession of villagers. Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Mrs. Bantry, noting how differently people responded to sudden crisis. Some moved with solemn purpose, others seemed almost energized by the drama, their voices dropping to excited whispers that somehow carried farther than normal conversation. The cottage presented a scene that would remain etched in the memories of all who witnessed it. The usually immaculate sitting room showed clear signs of struggle: an overturned side table, scattered papers, and a broken china shepherdess lying in pieces near the hearth. Mrs. Millicent Ashford lay motionless beside her favorite reading chair, her grey hair disheveled and a dark stain spreading across the Persian carpet beneath her still form. Dr. Haydock's examination was swift but thorough. When he looked up at the assembled faces, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid Mrs. Ashford is dead. This appears to be the result of a violent attack. We must contact the police immediately." Miss Marple positioned herself near the doorway, ostensibly comforting the distressed Mrs. Daly while actually observing the scene with the thoroughness of someone who understood that truth often lay hidden in the smallest details. Her keen eyes noted the scattered papers that appeared to be legal documents, the absence of Mrs. Ashford's usual jewelry, and most intriguingly, the muddy footprints that led from the back door to the sitting room. Footprints that seemed too large to belong to the deceased woman herself. The pronouncement of death settled over Ivy Cottage like a shroud, transforming the cheerful afternoon into something altogether more sinister. Dr. Haydock's words seemed to echo in the suddenly oppressive air of the sitting room, where Mrs. Ashford's still form lay beneath the hastily arranged blanket. The assembled villagers stood in shocked silence, their earlier theories about illness or accident dissolving into the harsh reality of deliberate violence. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his motorcar announcing his presence with an authoritative rumble that drew curious faces to cottage windows throughout the village. He was a man whose surname suited his approach to detective work: efficient, direct, and notably impatient with what he considered the romantic notions that country folk often attached to criminal matters. His sharp eyes surveyed the scene with professional detachment, while he issued crisp orders to the constables who had accompanied him from Much Benham. "Right then," Inspector Slack announced, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations of the gathered villagers. "I'll need everyone except Dr. Haydock to step outside while we examine the scene properly. This is a crime scene now, not a social gathering." Miss Marple found herself gently shepherded toward the garden path along with the others, though she managed to position herself near the cottage windows where she could observe the official proceedings. Her knitting bag remained clutched in her hands, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing as the inspector began his methodical examination of the disturbed sitting room. The evidence seemed to tell a straightforward story, at least to Inspector Slack's experienced eye. The overturned furniture, the scattered papers, and the missing jewelry all pointed toward a burglary that had turned violent when the homeowner returned unexpectedly. He noted the muddy footprints leading from the back door, the forced entry point, and made careful notes about the apparent struggle that had taken place near the fireplace. "Clear case of robbery gone wrong," he pronounced to Dr. Haydock, loud enough for the villagers gathered outside to hear. "These London criminals think nothing of venturing into the countryside these days. Poor woman probably surprised the burglar and paid for it with her life." Mrs. Daly, the cottage's cleaning woman, proved invaluable in cataloguing what appeared to be missing. Through her tears, she confirmed that Mrs. Ashford's sapphire brooch was gone, along with her pearl necklace and several other pieces of jewelry. Yet even as she provided this information, Mrs. Daly seemed puzzled by certain aspects of the theft. "It's odd, Inspector," she said, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. "The diamond earrings are still in the jewelry box, and they're worth twice what the pearls were. Mrs. Ashford always said so. Seems strange that a thief would know to take the pearls, but leave behind the more valuable pieces." Miss Marple found this observation particularly interesting, though she kept her thoughts to herself as Inspector Slack dismissed Mrs. Daly's concerns with a wave of his hand. "Criminals aren't always the brightest, Mrs. Daly. Probably grabbed what looked easiest to sell and ran when he heard someone coming." As the afternoon progressed, the inspector's attention was drawn to more promising leads. Several villagers mentioned Mrs. Ashford's nephew, Gerald Ashford, who had been a frequent and apparently unwelcome visitor to Ivy Cottage over the past month. The young man had been seen leaving the cottage that very morning, walking quickly toward the railway station with what appeared to be a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "Family disputes can turn nasty," Inspector Slack observed to his sergeant, making notes in his official notebook. "Especially when there's money involved. Could be this Gerald decided to take what he thought was rightfully his rather than wait for the old lady to change her wheel." Mrs. Bantry, eager to be helpful, provided additional details about the nephew's visits. "There were quite heated discussions, Inspector. Mrs. Ashford seemed terribly distressed after each visit. She mentioned something about papers that needed signing, legal documents of some sort. She was quite worried about it all." This information seemed to crystallize Inspector Slack's theory about the case. A greedy nephew pressing his elderly aunt about financial matters, growing increasingly desperate as she refused to cooperate. The scenario had all the elements of a classic family murder, dressed up to look like a burglary to throw suspicion off the obvious perpetrator. Miss Marple listened to these developments with the quiet attention of someone accustomed to observing human nature in all its complexity. While the inspector's theory certainly had merit, she found herself troubled by several small details that seemed to contradict the official narrative. The selective nature of the theft, for instance, suggested someone with specific knowledge about which pieces would be easiest to dispose of without attracting attention. More intriguingly, she had noticed during her brief time inside the cottage that the French clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at 22 minutes past 3. The timepiece bore a faint smear on its brass bezel, as though someone had touched it with unsteady hands. On the sideboard, 2 teacups sat on a polished mahogany tray, one bearing the faint trace of lipstick and a dusting of what appeared to be icing sugar, the other conspicuously clean and positioned slightly apart from its companion. These details suggested a more complex sequence of events than a simple burglary interrupted by an unexpected return. They spoke of a planned meeting, of refreshments served and consumed, of careful staging designed to misdirect investigation away from the true circumstances of Mrs. Ashford's death. As Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary examination and began making arrangements to locate and question Gerald Ashford, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the registered letter Mrs. Maple at the post office had mentioned. Mrs. Ashford had posted it just yesterday, addressed to a London legal firm, and had seemed particularly anxious about its safe delivery. The timing seemed significant, occurring so soon before her nephew's final visit and her subsequent death. The official investigation was proceeding along predictable lines, following the obvious trail of evidence toward the obvious suspect. Yet Miss Marple's long experience with human nature suggested that the truth might lie in a more subtle direction, hidden among the small inconsistencies and carefully arranged details that others had overlooked in their eagerness to solve the case quickly and efficiently. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead with an unusual heaviness, as though the village itself struggled to absorb the day's shocking events. Miss Marple found herself unable to settle into her customary routine of evening knitting and wireless programs. The comfortable rhythms of village life had been disrupted, and she sensed that beneath the surface, calm currents of speculation and unease were already beginning to flow. Inspector Slack had departed for Much Benham with confident assurances that Gerald Ashford would be apprehended before morning, leaving behind a constable to guard Ivy Cottage and strict instructions that no one was to disturb the scene. Yet Miss Marple observed that curiosity was indeed running high among her neighbours, manifesting in an unusual amount of evening strolling past the sealed cottage and animated conversations over garden fences. Mrs. Price appeared at Miss Marple's door just as the church clock struck 8, bearing a pot of tea and an expression that mingled distress with barely contained excitement. "I simply couldn't settle," she announced, installing herself in the chintz armchair without invitation. "Such dreadful business, and I keep thinking about what I saw this morning." Miss Marple poured tea with practiced grace while encouraging Mrs. Price's evident need to unburden herself. In her experience, Village observations often contained kernels of truth that more official investigations might overlook, particularly when they came from someone as naturally observant as Mrs. Price, whose kitchen window commanded an excellent view of Ivy Cottage's back garden. "I was up early, kneading bread for the fete," Mrs. Price continued, accepting her teacup with hands that trembled slightly, "when I saw that nephew of hers leaving the cottage around 9:15. But here's what strikes me as peculiar, Miss Marple. He wasn't walking like someone who just committed murder. He was strolling quite casually, stopping to examine Mrs. Ashford's roses, even pausing to pet that ginger cat that's always lurking about." This observation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A man fleeing the scene of violent crime would hardly have the composure to admire garden flowers or interact with neighborhood cats. The behavior Mrs. Price described suggested either remarkable sang-froid or complete innocence, neither of which aligned perfectly with Inspector Slack's theory of a desperate nephew driven to violence. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the front door. Mrs. Marple from the post office stood on the doorstep, her expression troubled. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Miss Marple, but I've been thinking about yesterday afternoon." Mrs. Ashford posted a registered letter to a London firm, Lanchester and Bream of Lincoln's Inn. Quite a substantial packet, and she seemed particularly anxious about its safe delivery. Miss Marple invited her in, recognizing the significance of this information. And this morning, a telegram arrived for Mrs. Ashford at 10:40 from London, signed simply G. It read, "Arrive before 3. Important to settle." I assumed it referred to Gerald naturally, but then around noon, a woman called asking directions to Ivy Cottage. Smart coat, fox collar, and one of those small hats with a veil, not from the village certainly. The picture that emerged grew increasingly complex. Mrs. Maple's account suggested that Mrs. Ashford had been expecting not one visitor, but possibly 2. The registered letter to a legal firm, dispatched the day before her death, implied she had been taking some form of legal action. The telegram suggested urgency, while the mysterious woman visitor introduced an entirely new element to the case. As Mrs. Marple departed, Miss Marple found herself contemplating these revelations alongside her earlier observations. The selective nature of the theft continued to trouble her. Why take the pearls, but leave the more valuable diamond earrings? The 2 teacups on the tray suggested Mrs. Ashford had indeed entertained a visitor, one who favored powdered pastries and wore lipstick in a shade the deceased woman never used. Mrs. Daly arrived shortly after 9, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late, Miss Marple, but something's been troubling me about Mr. Gerald's visits. He'd been pressing Mrs. Ashford to sign papers, giving him power of attorney over her affairs, claiming it was for her protection as she grew older. She was having none of it, said she was perfectly capable of managing her own business." This revelation cast Gerald's frequent visits in an entirely different light. Rather than simple family disputes about money, it suggested a calculated campaign to gain control of what might be considerable assets. Mrs. Daly continued, she was planning to change her will, had an appointment with her London solicitor next week. She had mentioned wanting to ensure her money went to people who would use it properly, not waste it on gambling and speculation. The implications were sobering. If Mrs. Ashford had indeed been planning to disinherit her nephew while simultaneously refusing to grant him power of attorney, Gerald would have found himself facing the complete loss of his expected inheritance. Yet the timeline remained problematic. If he had departed on the morning train as witnesses confirmed, when exactly had the fatal encounter occurred? Miss Marple's reflections were interrupted by Dr. Haydock, who paused at her gate on his evening rounds. "Curious thing," he mentioned. "Old Witheridge from the antique shop was quite put out earlier. Seems he had an appointment with Mrs. Ashford at 4 o'clock about some silver she was considering selling. When he saw the police activity, he didn't approach the cottage, but he mentioned seeing lights on in the sitting room." This detail added another layer of complexity to the timeline. If Witheridge had seen lights at 4 o'clock, it suggested either that Mrs. Ashford had been alive well into the afternoon, or that someone else had been in the cottage after her death. Neither possibility aligned neatly with the theory of a morning murder committed by the departed nephew. As the evening progressed and her visitors departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm while her mind worked through the accumulating evidence. Inspector Slack's confidence in Gerald Ashford's guilt seemed increasingly premature. The case presented too many inconsistencies, too many unexplained elements, too many alternative possibilities to be resolved by such a straightforward solution. The truth, she suspected, lay hidden among the small details that others had overlooked in their eagerness to solve the case quickly. The mysterious woman visitor, the carefully timed telegram, the registered letter to London solicitors, the selective theft of jewelry, all suggested a more sophisticated crime than a desperate nephew's clumsy attempt at staging a burglary. The morning brought news that seemed to vindicate Inspector Slack's confidence entirely. Gerald Ashford had been apprehended at his London lodgings and was being transported back to St. Mary Mead for questioning. The inspector's satisfaction was evident as his motor car pulled up to the village hall, which had been hastily converted into a temporary police station. Gerald emerged, looking pale and disheveled, his usual composure replaced by the bewildered expression of a man caught in circumstances beyond his comprehension. Miss Marple observed the proceedings from her garden gate, noting how Gerald's posture spoke more of confusion than guilt. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned to distinguish between the defensive crouch of the genuinely guilty and the upright bewilderment of the wrongly accused. Gerald's bearing suggested the latter, though she kept this observation to herself as the village buzzed with speculation about the arrest. The interrogation, conducted in the village hall's main room, proceeded with Inspector Slack's characteristic directness. Gerald readily admitted to his frequent visits to Ivy Cottage, explaining that he had been seeking his aunt's investment in a business venture that required substantial capital. "We had disagreements, certainly," he acknowledged, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "But they were family discussions, not violent confrontations. I left the cottage at 9:15, caught the 9:45 train to London, and spent the day in meetings with potential investors." When pressed about his alibi, Gerald produced a ticket stub and several business cards, though he admitted his schedule had included gaps between appointments. "I can provide names and contact information," he insisted, "but I wasn't continuously supervised, if that's what you're asking." The inspector's case seemed strengthened by Gerald's financial difficulties and his admission that the scattered papers in the sitting room were indeed documents he had brought for his aunt's consideration. Yet Miss Marple, hearing these details through Mrs. Bantry's efficient intelligence network, found herself troubled by inconsistencies that others seemed eager to overlook. Her concerns were given new dimension by the unexpected arrival of Mr. Lanchester, Mrs. Ashford's London solicitor. The distinguished gentleman had come to examine papers overlooked during the initial investigation, and Miss Marple, encountering him at her gate as he sought directions to the railway station, invited him for tea. His revelations proved illuminating and deeply troubling. Mrs. Ashford had written requesting an immediate change to her will, Mr. Lanchester confided, his voice heavy with regret. The new document was to exclude Gerald entirely, with her estate going to various charities. More significantly, she had enclosed detailed documentation about what she termed financial irregularities in Gerald's handling of family trust funds. Quite serious allegations: embezzlement, forged signatures, systematic theft spanning several years. This information cast Gerald's recent behavior in an entirely different light. Rather than simply seeking investment capital, he had apparently been attempting to prevent his aunt from exposing criminal activities that would destroy not only his inheritance but his freedom. The stakes had been far higher than anyone had realized. Yet even as this seemed to strengthen the case against Gerald, Mr. Lanchester introduced details that complicated the timeline once again. She had scheduled an appointment for next Tuesday to sign the new will and discuss pursuing criminal charges. She was quite determined, despite my warnings about family consequences. More intriguingly, he mentioned Mrs. Ashford's request that the firm investigate a woman named Vera Dale, who had recently contacted her, claiming to be a distant relative with important family information to share. The timing seemed remarkably coincidental. A mysterious relative appearing just as Mrs. Ashford prepared to disinherit Gerald and expose his crimes. Miss Marple found herself returning to the fundamental question that had troubled her from the beginning. When exactly had Mrs. Ashford died? Multiple witnesses confirmed Gerald's morning departure, yet the medical examination placed death between noon and 4 o'clock. The telegram received at 10:40, signed simply G, now appeared to refer to G. Bream of the law firm rather than Gerald, while the mysterious woman Mrs. Marple had seen asking directions around noon took on new significance as potentially being this Vera Dale. The physical evidence continued to perplex her as well. During her morning walk, she had paused at Ivy Cottage long enough to notice that Constable Briggs had observed a fine powder on the bookshelf near the door, the same sugary dust that clung to the baker's pastries sold at yesterday's fete. One of the books had been hastily reshelved, its spine slightly higher than its neighbors. The French clock on the mantelpiece bore not just the time of its stopping, but a faint smear that might have been soot, though Miss Marple suspected it could equally have been the residue from powdered gloves or confectioner's sugar. Most telling were the 2 teacups on the mahogany tray, one bearing lipstick traces and sugar dust, the other conspicuously clean and positioned separately. This suggested not a violent confrontation, but a planned meeting, refreshments served and consumed, followed by careful staging designed to misdirect investigation. The selective nature of the theft remained equally puzzling. Why take the pearl necklace but leave the more valuable diamond earrings? The choice suggested either specific knowledge about which pieces would be easiest to dispose of without attracting attention, or perhaps a more calculated plan to implicate Gerald specifically. As evening approached and Gerald remained in custody, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating inconsistencies. Inspector Slack's theory required either that multiple witnesses were mistaken about Gerald's departure time, or that the medical examination was fundamentally flawed. Neither seemed likely given the careful documentation of both. The truth, she suspected, lay hidden among the small details that others had dismissed in their eagerness to solve the case quickly and efficiently. The village might be satisfied with Gerald's arrest, but Miss Marple's long experience with human nature suggested that the real murderer remained at large, protected by a carefully constructed deception that relied on everyone's willingness to accept the obvious explanation rather than questioning the subtle inconsistencies that pointed toward a more complex and calculated crime. The morning following Gerald's arrest brought little peace to Miss Marple's orderly mind. While Inspector Slack's confidence seemed unshakable and the village had begun to settle into the comfortable rhythm of solved mystery, she found herself increasingly troubled by details that refused to align with the official narrative. The inconsistencies that had nagged at her from the beginning now demanded closer examination, and she resolved to conduct her own quiet investigation before the case was permanently closed. Her first destination was Ivy Cottage, where Constable Peterson stood guard with the weary resignation of a man assigned to protect an empty stable after the horse had bolted. Miss Marple approached with a basket of fresh scones for Mrs. Daly, who was attempting to restore some semblance of order to the violated sitting room. The constable, grateful for the unexpected refreshment, proved surprisingly talkative about the evidence that had been catalogued and dismissed. "Curious thing about the writing desk," he mentioned between appreciative bites. "Mrs. Daly says the old lady was particular about keeping her papers neat, but there was this account ledger lying face down on the floor. Seemed odd, given what we know about her habits." Miss Marple examined the desk with the careful attention of someone assessing domestic arrangements. The ledger in question, now properly upright, was indeed one of Mrs. Ashford's meticulously maintained household account books. Yet beneath it, partially concealed by scattered correspondence, lay an empty envelope bearing the distinctive letterhead of Lanchester and Bream Solicitors. The envelope's position suggested it had been hastily swept aside, perhaps after its contents had been examined and removed. Mrs. Ashford would never have left a book face down, Mrs. Daly confirmed when asked. It was one of her particular points of pride, keeping everything in its proper place. Someone was looking through that ledger, mark my words, though what they'd want with household accounts is beyond me. The implication was clear to Miss Marple's experienced eye. This was not the random destruction of a panicked burglar, but the careful work of someone searching for specific information. The empty solicitor's envelope suggested they had found what they sought among Mrs. Ashford's carefully preserved correspondence. Her next stop was the village post office, where Mrs. Marple proved eager to discuss the various communications that had passed through her domain. That registered letter Mrs. Ashford posted Tuesday was quite substantial, she confirmed. But there was also a telegram Wednesday morning, not from Gerald, as we assumed, but from the London firm. Documents received require immediate consultation. Signed, L. Bream. This revelation cast the mysterious telegram in an entirely different light. Rather than Gerald announcing his arrival, it appeared to be the solicitor's response to Mrs. Ashford's allegations about her nephew's financial irregularities. The timing suggested urgency on the legal firm's part, perhaps indicating the severity of the accusations contained in Mrs. Ashford's registered packet. Miss Marple's afternoon walk took her past Abbott's garage, where young Ned Carter was servicing the village doctor's motor car. His memory of the previous day's taxi fare proved remarkably detailed when encouraged by Miss Marple's gentle questioning and a packet of Mrs. Price's excellent ginger biscuits. Smart lady, she was, he recalled. Fox collar, small hat with a veil, paid cash and wanted speed to Much Benham. But here's the peculiar bit. She had me stop at the chemist's first. Came out with a small jar, looked like cold cream to me. Seemed particular about cleaning her hands before we continued to the railway station. The purchase of cold cream immediately after leaving Ivy Cottage suggested someone concerned about removing traces of their presence. Miss Marple's long experience with domestic arrangements told her that cold cream was indeed effective for removing various substances, including the residue left by handling certain types of paper or the faint traces that might linger after careful cleaning of surfaces. At the chemist's shop, Mr. Pemberton confirmed the sale with the precision of a man who took professional pride in his record-keeping. Lady with a fox collar, yes, purchased our finest cold cream, though she seemed particular about the brand. Said she needed something that would remove stains without leaving residue. Struck me as odd, given her refined appearance. The pieces of evidence were beginning to form a pattern that contradicted Inspector Slack's straightforward theory. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the selective nature of the theft. Pearls taken, but more valuable diamonds left behind. And the curious detail Constable Peterson had mentioned about the mahogany tea tray in the sitting room. 3 ring marks on the polish, he had observed. 2 cups were there when we arrived, but there's a faint circle where a third had been. Someone cleaned it away, but you can still see the mark if you know where to look. This suggested that Mrs. Ashford had indeed entertained 2 visitors, not 1, and that someone had carefully removed evidence of their presence while leaving the other cup deliberately in place. The precision of this deception spoke to careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence from her cottage sitting room. The official investigation had focused on the obvious elements: the scattered papers, the missing jewelry, the nephew with financial motives. Yet the subtle details painted a different picture entirely. A carefully orchestrated crime designed to implicate Gerald while concealing the true perpetrator's identity and objectives. The mysterious woman who had arrived by taxi, purchased cold cream to remove traces of her presence, and departed with suspicious haste represented a far more sophisticated criminal than Inspector Slack's theory allowed. Someone had committed murder with careful premeditation, then staged the scene to support a false narrative, while systematically removing evidence that might expose their true identity. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reached for her writing paper. The time had come to test her growing suspicions through more direct means, though she would need to proceed with considerable caution. The real murderer had demonstrated both cunning and ruthlessness, qualities that made them far more dangerous than the obvious suspect currently languishing in Much Benham's police cells. Miss Marple's letter to Mr. Lanchester bore fruit more quickly than she had anticipated. His reply, delivered with the Morning Post, contained information that cast the mysterious woman visitor in an entirely new and disturbing light. The solicitor's careful legal language could not disguise his obvious concern about developments that had troubled Mrs. Ashford far more than her nephew's financial irregularities. The woman calling herself Vera Dale had been persistent in her correspondence. Mr. Lanchester wrote, claiming distant family connection and requesting meetings to discuss matters of mutual inheritance. Mrs. Ashford became convinced that someone was systematically investigating her background, her finances, and her daily routines. She was particularly troubled by this woman's detailed knowledge of family history that should have been known only to immediate relatives. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding entirely. What had appeared to be a simple family dispute over money now seemed to be something far more calculating, a deliberate campaign by an outsider to insinuate herself into Mrs. Ashford's life and affairs. The timing of Gerald's financial difficulties had provided perfect cover for a more sophisticated deception. Her contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Daly, who arrived in considerable distress with news that added another crucial piece to the puzzle. "I've been thinking about that woman who visited Tuesday," she explained, accepting Miss Marple's offer of tea with trembling hands. "Something bothered me about her appearance, but I couldn't place it until this morning. The way she held her head, the particular gesture she made when adjusting her hat. I've seen it before, but on a much younger person." Miss Marple encouraged her to continue while pouring tea with practiced calm. In her experience, delayed recognition often provided the most valuable insights, particularly when it came from someone as observant as Mrs. Daly. There was a maid who worked for Mrs. Ashford in London years ago, dismissed for theft, according to Mrs. Ashford, though she never liked to discuss the details. The resemblance is quite striking now that I think about it. Same height, same way of moving, though older and dressed much finer. This connection between past and present provided the missing link Miss Marple had been seeking. A dismissed servant would have intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's habits, her finances, her family connections, and, most importantly, her vulnerabilities. Such a person would know exactly which jewelry pieces would be easiest to dispose of, which documents might be valuable, and how to stage a scene that would deflect suspicion toward obvious suspects. The afternoon brought confirmation from an unexpected source, when young Ned Carter from Abbott's garage stopped by with information about the mysterious taxi fare. "That lady with the fox collar," he reported. "She had me stop at the chemist's before continuing to Much Benham Station. Came out with a small jar. Looked like cold cream to me. Seemed particular about cleaning her hands before we went on." The purchase of cold cream immediately after leaving Ivy Cottage suggested someone concerned about removing traces of their presence. Miss Marple's long experience with domestic arrangements told her that cold cream was indeed effective for removing various substances, including residue from handling papers or faint traces that might linger after careful cleaning of surfaces. At the railway station, the station master proved eager to contribute his observations. Lady with a fox collar arrived on the 11:52 from Paddington, took a hired car to St. Mary Mead. Came back for the 2:37 to London. No luggage to speak of, just a small handbag. Bought her ticket in cash. Oh, and she changed her gloves on the platform. Seemed particular about their cleanliness. The detail of the gloves fitted perfectly with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the crime. Someone had indeed been very careful about leaving no traces of their presence, yet had overlooked the subtle evidence that domestic experience could detect. Her most significant discovery came during a brief visit to Ivy Cottage, where she observed details that others had dismissed as unimportant. In the scullery, partially concealed behind a coal scuttle, lay a stiff bristled brush with a faint dusting of fine white powder still caught in the bristles. When she touched it and brought her finger to the light, the substance proved to be icing sugar, the same confectioner's dust that clung to pastries from yesterday's village fete. More telling still were the muddy footprints leading from the back door to the sitting room. Their edges were too sharp for fresh mud, looking impressed rather than naturally made. A distinction that domestic life teaches quickly when garden paths are used by different household members. Someone had carefully created the appearance of an intruder's entry while actually working from inside the cottage. The evening brought news that seemed to vindicate Inspector Slack's confidence in Gerald's guilt, yet actually undermined his entire theory. A telegram from London confirmed that Gerald had lunched at the Merchants' Club at 1:15, with 2 witnesses placing him there well past 2 o'clock. He could not have been in St. Mary Mead between noon and 4 without taking specific trains, and there was no evidence he had taken either. It doesn't exonerate him from arranging the thing, Inspector Slack insisted when Miss Marple encountered him at the village hall. He could have hired someone. The jewelry's the point. Someone will try to pass those pearls. Miss Marple allowed herself a small inward smile. If they were taken for profit, perhaps. But I have sometimes noticed, Inspector, that when people take something, the thing taken has more meaning than value. Old Mrs. Symes once carried off the vicar's plum pudding not because it was better than her own, which it wasn't, but because she had felt slighted at a church raffle. The inspector's theory required either that multiple witnesses were mistaken about Gerald's whereabouts, or that he had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy. Yet the evidence Miss Marple had gathered suggested something far more sophisticated. A crime committed by someone with intimate knowledge of the household, careful planning, and the skill to stage a deception that would implicate the obvious suspect while concealing their own involvement entirely. The real murderer, she was becoming convinced, had not only planned Mrs. Ashford's death, but had meticulously crafted every detail to ensure that suspicion would fall elsewhere, leaving them free to disappear with both stolen property and the satisfaction of a perfectly executed crime. The morning brought news that should have vindicated Inspector Slack's theory, but instead left him grappling with uncomfortable contradictions. Gerald Ashford's alibi had been confirmed beyond doubt. 3 witnesses placed him at his London club well past 2 o'clock, making his presence in St. Mary Mead during the crucial afternoon hours impossible. Yet rather than abandoning his theory, the inspector clung to the possibility of conspiracy, muttering about hired accomplices and elaborate schemes that seemed increasingly far-fetched with each passing hour. Miss Marple found herself drawn to Mr. Witheridge's antique shop, where the elderly proprietor was attempting to restore normalcy to his routine while clearly struggling with the weight of what he had witnessed. His hands trembled as he unlocked the narrow shop with its gleaming displays of silver cruets and polished snuff boxes, each piece arranged with the precision of someone who understood the value of proper presentation. "I've been thinking about Tuesday afternoon," he confided when Miss Marple inquired gently about his missed appointment. "I arrived at Ivy Cottage just past 4 o'clock, as arranged. The curious thing was seeing lights on in the sitting room, one of those small silk-shaded lamps Mrs. Ashford favoured. I knocked and waited, hearing the church clock strike the quarter hour. There was definitely movement behind the curtains, a shadow passing across the window, yet no one answered my call." This testimony struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. If Mr. Witheridge had observed lights and movement at 4 o'clock, it suggested either that Mrs. Ashford had been alive well into the afternoon, or that someone else had been in the cottage after her death. Neither possibility aligned with the theory of a morning murder followed by hasty departure. "Had you encountered the woman with the fox collar before Tuesday?" Miss Marple asked with characteristic mildness. His expression grew troubled. Indeed, about a fortnight ago, she came into the shop asking about the market value of Georgian silver, whether I purchased small items for cash. When I explained my requirements regarding provenance, she smiled in a way that made me rather uncomfortable. Left her name as V. Dale, but declined to provide additional details. The implication was clear. This mysterious visitor had been conducting reconnaissance, gathering information about how stolen goods might be disposed of while maintaining the appearance of casual inquiry. Such careful preparation spoke to methodical planning rather than desperate improvisation. Her next stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found the physician reviewing his examination notes with the thoroughness of someone seeking answers that continued to elude him. When pressed gently for additional details, he revealed information that transformed her understanding of the crime entirely. The fatal blow was certainly the cause of death, he confirmed, but there were other factors I initially overlooked. Mrs. Ashford had consumed a substantial quantity of brandy shortly before death, most unusual for someone who was practically teetotal. More significantly, I detected traces of sleeping powder in her system, though not in fatal quantities. This revelation cast the entire sequence of events in a different light. Mrs. Ashford had not been killed during a violent struggle, but had been incapacitated first through drugging, then murdered while helpless. The overturned furniture and scattered papers were not evidence of desperate conflict, but careful staging designed to support a false narrative of interrupted burglary. Returning to Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple conducted a more thorough examination of the physical evidence that others had dismissed as unimportant. On the mantelpiece, nestled among dried potpourri, she discovered a single small pearl, dull and slightly misshapen, clearly not from a valuable necklace. When she mentioned this to Mrs. Daly, the cleaning woman's response proved illuminating. "Those weren't Mrs. Ashford's good pearls," she explained. She called them her country pearls. Lovely but imperfect, not uniformly matched. Her truly valuable string was kept safely in the bank vault. The selective nature of the theft became even more significant with this knowledge. Someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's possessions had deliberately chosen the less valuable necklace, perhaps because it would be easier to dispose of without attracting attention from dealers who might recognize truly precious pieces. Near the back door, Miss Marple observed the muddy footprints that had been cited as evidence of forced entry. Yet their edges were too sharp, their placement too uniform to represent natural tracking of mud. Someone had carefully created the impression of an intruder's passage while actually working from inside the cottage. The afternoon brought confirmation of her growing suspicions when news arrived that the stolen pearls had been discovered at a London pawn shop. Yet rather than providing closure, this development raised new questions. The pearls had been rejected by the pawnbroker as worthless paste, a revelation that cast the entire robbery in a different light. "Paste pearls," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "Someone who steals for profit doesn't typically choose worthless imitations over genuine valuables, unless, of course, the theft was never about profit at all." Mrs. Daly's memories of the dismissed maid proved crucial to understanding the true scope of the deception. Vera Dalton was always clever with cosmetics, she recalled. Could make herself look quite different when she chose. She had this unsettling habit of studying people's mannerisms, copying the way they moved and spoke. Quite theatrical, really. This ability to assume different appearances explained how Vera had managed to approach Mrs. Ashford without immediate recognition. Years of planning had given her time to perfect her disguise and rehearse her performance as a distant relative, while her intimate knowledge of the household had enabled her to stage a convincing crime scene. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of deception that had been woven around Mrs. Ashford's murder. Gerald remained free but under suspicion, his financial motives and family disputes providing perfect misdirection for the real crime. Yet the evidence pointed unmistakably toward a far more sophisticated perpetrator. Someone who had executed a carefully planned revenge while ensuring that suspicion would fall elsewhere, leaving them free to disappear with both stolen property and the satisfaction of a perfectly orchestrated deception. The discovery that the stolen pearls were worthless paste sent ripples of confusion through Inspector Slack's investigation, yet for Miss Marple it provided the crucial insight that had been eluding her from the beginning. If theft had never been the true motive, then the entire crime transformed into something far more personal and calculated. A carefully orchestrated revenge disguised as opportunistic burglary. The question now became not who had committed the crime, but how to prove her growing suspicions without alerting the real perpetrator. Her opportunity for deeper investigation came through Mrs. Clement, who arrived for their weekly charitable committee meeting bearing information that cast the mysterious Vera Dale in an entirely new and disturbing light. "I've been corresponding with my cousin in Hampstead," she announced, settling into her usual chair, with the satisfaction of someone possessing important intelligence. She remembers the Ashford household quite well from her social visiting days, and there's far more to that dismissed maid than simple pilfering. Miss Marple encouraged her to continue while preparing tea with methodical care, recognizing that the most significant revelations often emerged from seemingly casual conversations among neighbors who had no idea of their importance to a larger investigation. Vera Dalton was operating a sophisticated scheme, Mrs. Clement continued, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone reserved for truly scandalous revelations. She would forge references to obtain positions in wealthy households, work just long enough to learn the family's routines and valuables, then stage thefts that implicated other servants. Mrs. Ashford discovered the entire operation and not only dismissed her, but testified against her at trial. Vera received 2 years in Holloway prison for fraud and theft. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding completely. The crime was not about inheritance disputes or financial desperation, but about a calculated campaign of revenge by someone who had nursed grievances for years while perfecting her skills at deception and manipulation. The timing of Gerald's financial difficulties had provided perfect cover for a plan that was far more personal and vindictive than anyone had realized. Armed with this knowledge, Miss Marple began formulating a strategy to draw the real murderer into the open. She spent the following morning in quiet contemplation, her mind sifting through the accumulated evidence like a careful housekeeper sorting through precious items. The paste pearls, the drugged brandy, the staged footprints, the cold cream purchase, the changed gloves, the deliberately scattered papers, all pointed to a single, calculating intelligence that knew Mrs. Ashford intimately and had anticipated every aspect of the subsequent investigation. Her plan crystallized around a simple but effective deception. She arranged with Mrs. Daly and Mrs. Bantry to organize a small memorial gathering at Ivy Cottage, ostensibly to sort through Mrs. Ashford's personal effects and prepare some items for charitable donation. The idea, circulated discreetly through the village's efficient gossip network, was designed to reach the ears of anyone who might still have unfinished business at the cottage. It would be a kindness, Miss Marple suggested to Mrs. Daly, her voice gentle yet purposeful, to help clear away some of the more intimate things before the official inventory. Perhaps a few familiar faces would make the task less overwhelming for poor Mrs. Ashford's memory. As the appointed afternoon arrived, Miss Marple positioned herself in Mrs. Ashford's sitting room, the scene of the crime now meticulously cleaned but still bearing subtle echoes of the violence that had occurred there. Mrs. Daly nervously polished a silver frame while Mrs. Bantry thoughtfully sorted through books, the air thick with unspoken tragedy and anticipation. A faint rustle from the garden caught Miss Marple's attention. Through the lace curtains, she glimpsed a figure observing the cottage from behind the rose bushes, a small, veiled hat and dark coat that seemed familiar despite the careful attempt at concealment. The watcher lingered for several minutes, apparently unable to resist witnessing the aftermath of her handiwork, or perhaps checking for anything she might have overlooked in her previous visit. Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous prey often revealed themselves through their own curiosity. After what seemed an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, a hesitant knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Daly, startled from her nervous polishing, opened it to reveal a woman whose features, though carefully composed, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the descriptions of the mysterious Vera Dale. "I do hope I'm not intruding," the woman said, her voice cultivated and her manners impeccable. "I'm Mrs. Henderson, a distant relative who only just learned of poor Mrs. Ashford's passing. I felt compelled to pay my respects, though I realized the timing might seem inappropriate." Her gaze swept over the sitting room with what appeared to be respectful curiosity, but which Miss Marple recognized as something far more calculating. The woman's eyes lingered on the mantelpiece where the broken shepherdess had been cleared away, then darted briefly to the empty jewelry box on the dresser before returning to the assembled mourners with practiced sympathy. "Such a dreadful tragedy," Mrs. Henderson continued, accepting Mrs. Bantry's offer of tea with gracious appreciation. "Poor Millicent. I understand it was a burglary that turned violent. How terrifying her final moments must have been." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in their familiar rhythm, decided the moment had come to begin her subtle interrogation. "Indeed, Mrs. Henderson," she said, her tone sympathetic and conversational, "though I confess the details surrounding her passing remain rather puzzling. The police seem convinced it was a simple robbery, yet there are such curious inconsistencies. For instance, they took her pearl necklace but left behind far more valuable items. Rather odd behavior for a common thief, wouldn't you say?" As she spoke, Miss Marple watched Mrs. Henderson with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades observing human nature in all its complexity. The woman's composure was remarkable, but not quite perfect, a barely perceptible tightening around the eyes, a momentary stiffening of posture that suggested Miss Marple's words had struck closer to home than intended. The game, Miss Marple realized with quiet satisfaction, was finally entering its most crucial phase. Mrs. Henderson's pause was barely perceptible, yet Miss Marple's experienced eye caught the momentary stiffening of her posture, the slight tremor in her gloved fingers as she adjusted her teacup. The reaction confirmed what the elderly detective had suspected from the moment this elegantly dressed woman had appeared at the cottage door with her carefully rehearsed sympathy and practiced grief. "How distressing for poor Gerald," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice maintaining its cultivated tone while her eyes betrayed a flicker of something more calculating. "Though I suppose thieves aren't always the most discerning creatures. Perhaps the unfortunate man simply grabbed whatever seemed most portable in his panic." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she observed her visitor with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades cataloging the subtle ways people revealed their secrets. "Oh, but that's precisely what troubles me, my dear. You see, the pearls that were taken weren't valuable at all, merely paste copies that Mrs. Ashford kept for everyday wear. Her genuine jewelry was safely deposited at the bank. It does make one wonder what sort of burglar would choose worthless imitations over authentic diamonds sitting in plain view." The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Henderson's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, with hands that were no longer quite steady. For just an instant, her carefully composed features revealed genuine surprise, the reaction of someone whose elaborate planning had encountered an unexpected flaw. "Paste pearls," she repeated, and Miss Marple noted how the woman's voice carried a note of authentic shock rather than polite interest. "How extraordinary. Though I suppose dear Millicent was always so security-conscious about her valuables." The casual use of Mrs. Ashford's Christian name struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Someone claiming to be a distant relative who had only recently learned of the death would hardly display such familiar intimacy. More revealing still was Mrs. Henderson's instinctive knowledge of the deceased woman's security habits, information that suggested a far deeper acquaintance than initially claimed. Miss Marple decided to test her growing certainty with a more direct approach. "I wonder, Mrs. Henderson, if you might have encountered Millicent during your working years." Mrs. Daly mentioned that she often spoke fondly of various household staff from her London days. She had such a remarkable memory for faces, even after considerable time had passed. The question hung in the air like a carefully placed snare. Mrs. Henderson's composure wavered visibly as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't compromise her assumed identity. Her hands moved nervously to adjust her hat, a gesture that Mrs. Daly recognized with a sharp intake of breath, remembering the dismissed maid's characteristic mannerisms from years past. "I'm afraid I never had the pleasure of working in Mrs. Ashford's household," Mrs. Henderson replied, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Our family connection was quite distant, through marriage rather than direct relation." Yet even as she spoke, her restless gaze continued surveying the sitting room with the familiarity of someone who knew every detail intimately. The faded spot on the wallpaper where a picture had once hung, the worn patch on the Persian carpet near Mrs. Ashford's favorite reading chair, the particular way afternoon light illuminated the mahogany sideboard where 2 teacups had once sat in telling arrangement. Miss Marple pressed her advantage with characteristic gentleness. "How lovely that you maintained contact despite the distance. Though I understand Millicent had become rather cautious about unexpected visitors in recent years." She mentioned to Mrs. Daly that someone had been making inquiries about her routines, her finances, even her household arrangements. Quite unsettling for someone of her naturally private disposition. This observation struck home with devastating accuracy. Mrs. Henderson's breathing became slightly labored, and she reached for her handbag with movements that suggested barely controlled panic rather than casual preparation to depart. "I really must be going," she announced abruptly, rising from her chair with unseemly haste. "I've imposed on your kindness quite long enough, and I have a train to catch." Miss Marple's knitting needles never paused in their steady rhythm. "Oh, but surely you have time for another cup of tea." Mrs. Daly was just about to show us some of Millicent's photograph albums from her London years. "I'm certain there would be pictures of various household staff. You might recognize some familiar faces from your family connections." The suggestion of photographic evidence proved to be the final pressure point. Mrs. Henderson's carefully maintained facade began to crumble as she realized that her meticulously constructed disguise was about to be exposed by documentary proof. The mask of genteel sympathy slipped, revealing features hardened by years of resentment and calculation. "I really must insist on leaving immediately," she said, her voice now carrying the sharp edge of desperation. "I have urgent business that cannot be delayed." Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped her at the doorway with words that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I think, Vera Dalton, that your business here was concluded on Tuesday afternoon when you murdered Mrs. Ashford in this very room. The only question now is whether you'll have the grace to acknowledge the truth, or whether we must wait for Inspector Slack to arrive with the warrant that was requested this morning." The use of her real name struck Vera like a physical blow. She stood frozen, her carefully constructed identity crumbling around her like autumn leaves in a sudden wind. The game was finally over, and the afternoon light slanting through the cottage windows illuminated a scene that would soon provide the resolution to a mystery that had tested everyone's faith in obvious explanations and simple solutions. For a long moment, silence settled over the cottage sitting room like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. The French clock's gentle ticking seemed unnaturally loud as Vera Dalton stood frozen in the doorway, her carefully constructed identity crumbling around her like autumn leaves. Miss Marple's knitting needles never paused in their steady rhythm, though her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the woman whose elaborate deception was finally unraveling. "You have no proof," Vera said finally, though her voice had lost the cultivated refinement of Mrs. Henderson and carried instead the harder edge of someone whose mask had slipped beyond recovery. Miss Marple inclined her head with gentle understanding. Proof is such a curious thing, my dear. Often it's the smallest details that reveal the most significant truths. For instance, when you mentioned that the clock had stopped at 22 minutes past 3, you demonstrated knowledge that only someone present at the time of death could possess. The effect was immediate and devastating. Vera's face went pale as she realized her fatal error. Correcting Miss Marple's deliberately incorrect time had revealed intimate knowledge of the crime scene that no innocent visitor could have acquired. Mrs. Daly pressed herself against the wall, finally recognizing in this elegant stranger the dismissed maid whose mannerisms had seemed so hauntingly familiar. Mrs. Bantry, ever practical, had quietly positioned herself near the telephone, though the sound of motor cars approaching from the lane suggested that official assistance was already at hand. "You see," Miss Marple continued in her conversational tone, "the evidence has been accumulating quite steadily, though I confess it took some time to see the complete picture. Gerald's alibi was unshakable. Multiple witnesses placed him in London well past 2 o'clock, making his presence here during the crucial afternoon hours impossible. Yet someone with intimate knowledge of this household had committed a very carefully planned murder." Inspector Slack entered the cottage with his characteristic brisk efficiency, followed by 2 constables whose presence seemed to drain the last of Vera's defiance. She sank into the nearest chair with the defeated posture of someone whose elaborate gamble had finally failed. "The sleeping powder in the brandy told us this was premeditated," Miss Marple explained to the inspector while keeping her gentle gaze on Vera. "Poor Mrs. Ashford was incapacitated before she was killed, which explained the lack of defensive wounds and the careful staging of the scene. The overturned furniture and scattered papers were arranged to suggest violent struggle, but a truly panicked burglar wouldn't have been so methodical about creating the illusion." She gestured toward the mahogany sideboard, where the tea service had been discovered. 3 ring marks on the tray showed that Mrs. Ashford had entertained 2 visitors, not 1. Someone had carefully removed evidence of their presence while leaving deliberate traces to implicate Gerald. The muddy footprints from the back door were too perfectly placed, too sharply defined. They were impressed rather than naturally tracked. Vera's shoulders sagged as each piece of evidence was methodically presented. "She recognized me the moment I walked through her door," she whispered, her voice now carrying the bitter edge of years of accumulated resentment. "Even with the changed appearance, the different clothes, the careful disguise, she knew exactly who I was." "I believe she did," Miss Marple agreed sadly. Mrs. Ashford had been expecting this confrontation for some time. She had already contacted her solicitor about Gerald's financial irregularities and was preparing legal action. But she also suspected that someone was systematically investigating her affairs, gathering information about her routines and vulnerabilities. The revelation of Vera's true identity as the dismissed maid who had served 2 years in Holloway prison for fraud cast the entire crime in its proper light. This was not about inheritance or financial desperation, but about a carefully orchestrated revenge that had consumed years of planning and hatred. "The paste pearls were the final clue," Miss Marple observed. "A common thief would have taken the valuable diamond earrings, but someone with intimate household knowledge knew that Mrs. Ashford kept her genuine jewelry at the bank and wore only imitations for daily wear. Taking the worthless pearls served 2 purposes. It maintained the illusion of robbery while ensuring the stolen goods would eventually be discovered as paste, further implicating Gerald in a poorly planned crime." As Inspector Slack formally arrested Vera Dalton, she offered no resistance, the fight finally gone out of her. The elaborate deception that had consumed years of preparation had collapsed in the space of a single afternoon, brought down by the patient observation of an elderly woman who understood that truth always emerges when people are willing to look beyond obvious explanations. Gerald Ashford would be released with apologies, though his financial irregularities would still require legal resolution. The village would eventually return to its comfortable rhythms, though Ivy Cottage would always carry the shadow of what had occurred within its walls. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead once again, Miss Marple sat quietly in her own cottage, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. Human nature, she reflected, remained endlessly fascinating in its capacity for both calculation and self-deception. Vera had planned what she believed to be the perfect murder, yet had been undone by her own need to witness its aftermath and correct a deliberately incorrect detail about the timing. The comfortable sounds of village life gradually reasserted themselves. The distant laughter of children, the gentle closing of garden gates, the satisfied murmur of neighbors discussing the day's extraordinary events. Truth had prevailed, as it usually did when people were patient enough to look beyond surface appearances, though the cost had been measured in lives forever changed by the consequences of old grievances and carefully nurtured hatred. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and moved to draw the curtains against the gathering dusk. Tomorrow there would be statements and formalities, the inevitable wild speculation at the post office, and the gradual process of healing that small communities undergo after their peaceful surface has been disturbed by violence. But tonight, justice had been served with the quiet efficiency that she had always found more satisfying than dramatic confrontations or elaborate revelations. The village would remember Mrs. Ashford's last visitor, but it would also remember that truth, however carefully concealed, eventually finds its way to the surface when observed by those who understand that the most significant mysteries are often solved not through brilliant deduction, but through patient attention to the small inconsistencies that reveal the larger patterns of human behavior.